The quiet streets of ancient Rome at night. When the sun disappeared behind the stone rooftops of ancient Rome, the city did not fall silent. Instead, it whispered. Stone streets cooled slowly after a long, dusty day. The sounds of sandals faded. Wealthy homes closed their wooden doors. Oil lamps flickered like tired stars along narrow alleys. This was the hour when Rome exhaled. Most people imagine ancient Rome as loud, crowded, and endlessly busy. But at night, Rome became something else entirely. Softer, slower, almost sleepy. And this was the time when hunger quietly returned. For many Romans, dinner was not a grand feast. It was not eaten on golden plates or served by slaves. That version of Rome belonged only to the rich. For the rest, food was something found late, cheaply, and quickly. As darkness settled, small street kitchens began to glow. These places were called thermopolia. From the outside, they looked simple, just stone counters with round holes carved into them. Inside those holes sat large clay pots, still warm from the day. These were Rome's fast food restaurants. The air smelled of bread, oil, smoke, and something slightly sour. No menus, no seating, just tired people standing quietly, waiting for something hot to calm their stomachs. A worker might stop by after a long day carrying bricks. A mother might bring a child wrapped in cloth. A soldier might lean against the counter, helmet resting at his feet. They did not talk much. Eating was not entertainment, it was survival. The food was simple, sometimes beans, sometimes lentils, often bread soaked in cheap wine, and occasionally, meat, but never the kind you would proudly describe. No one asked questions about where the meat came from. In ancient Rome, asking too much could ruin your appetite. A vendor would scoop food from a clay pot, steam rising slowly into the night air. The portion was small, the price was low, the taste, forgettable. And yet, people kept coming back. Because hunger is louder than curiosity. Rome had no refrigerators, no food safety laws, no clean water flowing into every home. Most people lived in tiny apartments called insulae, where cooking was dangerous. Fire spread fast in Rome. So the city cooked for them. But not kindly. As you walk quietly through these streets, imagining the soft echo of footsteps and the distant bark of a dog, you begin to realize something unsettling. Ancient Rome, for all its greatness, fed its people in a way that barely kept them alive. This was junk food before the word existed. Cheap calories, empty nutrition, quick comfort. And just like modern junk food, it slowly changed the bodies and minds of the people who depended on it. Few Romans thought about that as they ate. They were just tired. They just wanted the quiet ache in their stomachs to stop. And as oil lamps dimmed and bowls emptied, the city slowly drifted toward sleep, unaware of how deeply its food would shape its future. In the next chapter, we will step closer to the stone counters and look carefully into those clay pots. Because what Romans called food might surprise you. Roman junk food, fast meals for the poor and busy. Part 1: The food that was never meant to be remembered. As morning light slowly reached the streets of ancient Rome, the city began to wake once again. Wooden shutters opened with a soft creak. Footsteps echoed against stone. Somewhere, a donkey brayed impatiently, waiting to be loaded. Rome did not wake gently. It woke hungry. For most Romans, breakfast was not a meal in the modern sense. There were no tables filled with warm bread and fresh fruit. There was no time for that, and often, no money. Instead, hunger followed people out of their homes like a quiet shadow. The poor made up the majority of Rome's population. They lived stacked on top of one another in tall apartment buildings that leaned slightly, as if tired of standing. Inside these cramped rooms, there were no kitchens. No stoves. No ovens. No safe way to cook. Fire was Rome's greatest fear. One careless flame could destroy an entire neighborhood. And so, cooking indoors was discouraged, sometimes forbidden. This meant something important. Rome did not cook at home. Rome ate outside. By mid-morning, the thermopolia were open again. These small street food shops were everywhere, on busy roads, near bathhouses, beside markets, and close to construction sites. They were built into the city itself, carved into stone walls as if they had always been there. Most Romans passed them daily. And most Romans depended on them completely. The food sold here was never meant to impress. It was meant to be fast. The counters were made of stone, worn smooth by thousands of elbows. Large clay jars were embedded into the surface, each holding something warm and filling. Or at least, something that pretended to be. The vendors worked quietly. They did not smile much. There was no reason to. This was not a place of joy. This was a place of routine. A laborer would approach the counter, drop a coin, and receive a small bowl. He would eat standing, leaning against the wall, eyes already thinking about the rest of his day. There was no conversation about taste. No one asked, "Is this good?" The only question that mattered was, "Is it enough?" Most of the time, the answer was no. The food was thin. Soups were watered down. Stews were stretched to feed as many mouths as possible. Beans were common. Lentils even more so. They filled the stomach quickly but left the body tired. Bread was everywhere. Cheap bread. Hard bread. Old bread. Sometimes it was soaked in liquid to make it easier to chew. Sometimes it was burned on one side and raw on the other. It did not matter. Hunger makes everything taste the same. Meat, when it appeared, was rarely fresh. Animals were expensive. Good cuts were reserved for the wealthy. What reached the Thermopylae was what remained. Scraps. Leftovers. Parts that were difficult to sell elsewhere. No labels existed. No rules. No inspections. If it smelled acceptable, it was sold. Sausages were popular, because they hid the truth. Inside, anything could be mixed. Old meat. Fat. Grain. Spices strong enough to mask decay. Romans loved spices, not for flavor, but for protection against doubt. Pepper, garlic, and herbs were used heavily, not to enhance food, but to cover it. A strong smell meant fewer questions. Children ate this food too. They stood beside their parents, small bowls in their hands, learning early that meals were something you endured, not enjoyed. There were days when food ran out early. When the clay jars sat empty before sunset. On those days, people waited. They waited quietly, hoping another pot would appear, or another vendor would open. Sometimes, it didn't. And hunger followed them home. Rome was a city of abundance, but only for a few. For the many, junk food was not a choice. It was the only option. The rich laughed at the poor for eating street slop. But they never asked how else a man without a kitchen was supposed to survive. As the day wore on, the streets grew louder. But beneath the noise, something constant remained. A tired stomach. A tired body. A tired city. And slowly, without realizing it, Rome was feeding itself into weakness. In the next part of this chapter, we will look closely at what these foods were really made of, and why they quietly damaged the people who depended on them. What was really inside the clay pots? As the day moved slowly toward afternoon, the food inside Rome's street kitchens changed. Not in quality, but in truth. By midday, the freshest ingredients, if they could be called fresh at all, were already gone. What remained inside the clay pots was food that had been reheated, watered down, and stretched thin. Very thin. The vendors did not waste anything. They could not afford to. If a pot of stew became too thick, water was added. If meat began to dry, oil was poured over it. If bread became too hard, it was soaked until it fell apart. Everything was reused. Nothing was thrown away. From the outside, the food still looked warm and comforting. Steam rose gently. The surface shimmered with oil. The smell was strong enough to feel filling on its own. But inside, the food was slowly losing what little nourishment it once had. Most Romans did not understand nutrition. They understood fullness. A full stomach meant strength. An empty one meant weakness. So they ate until the hunger quieted, even if their bodies were still starving. One of the most common items sold in the Thermopylae was a thick porridge made from grain. It was cheap. It was heavy. And it was everywhere. This porridge, often made from barley or wheat, was cooked for hours. Then cooked again. And sometimes again. By the time it reached the customer, it had been stripped of much of its goodness. But it filled space. And space was what hunger demanded. Vegetables were added when available, cabbage, onions, or greens that were already beginning to wilt. They were chopped small so no one could tell how old they were. Meat, when mixed in, was treated carefully. Not because it was valued, but because it was dangerous. Meat spoiled quickly in the Roman heat. There was no ice, no refrigeration, only salt and hope. So vendors used heavy spices and vinegar to preserve what they could. Vinegar was especially important. It masked smell and slowed decay. If food burned the tongue slightly with sourness, that was considered a good sign. It meant it was still safe. Most of the time, fish sauces were also common. One in particular was famous, and feared. Garum. Garum was made by fermenting fish intestines, blood, and scraps in the sun for weeks or even months. The smell was powerful, overwhelming, but Romans loved it. A small amount could turn bland food into something exciting, or at least something distracting. Garum was poured over bread, vegetables, and meat scraps. It added salt and flavor to otherwise lifeless meals. But it also added risk. When poorly made, and it often was, it could cause sickness. Stomach pain, fever, weakness. Still, people ate it. Because hunger does not wait for safety. As afternoon shadows stretched across the streets, another kind of customer arrived. Travelers. Rome was full of them, merchants, messengers, and soldiers passing through. They needed food fast, and they needed it cheap. They did not know which vendors were careful and which were careless. They trusted the smell. They trusted the steam. Sometimes, they paid for that trust later. Food poisoning was common, so common that Romans barely talked about it. A day of pain was considered normal. A night of sickness was unfortunate, but expected. Only death caused concern, and even then, it was rarely blamed on food. The body weakened quietly over time. Children grew slowly. Adults tired easily. Old people faded early. And no one connected it to what they ate every day. By late afternoon, the food pots were nearly empty. What remained was thick, dry, and darkened from hours of heat. Vendors scraped the bottom carefully. Those last servings were the cheapest. And often the worst. Yet they sold quickly. Because those who arrived late were often the hungriest. As evening approached, the Thermopylae prepared once more for the night crowd. New pots were brought out. Not truly new, just refilled. And the cycle began again. Rome fed itself. Constantly, endlessly, without ever truly nourishing its people. In the final part of this chapter, we will see how this daily diet slowly reshaped Roman bodies, habits, and even their thinking, in ways that history rarely talks about. How cheap food quietly changed Roman lives. As evening slowly wrapped itself around the city of Rome, the streets softened once again. The loud shouts of merchants faded. Tools were set down. Shoulders slumped as tired bodies searched for rest. This was the most important hour for the Thermopylae. Not because the food was better, but because the people were more desperate. After a full day of labor, hunger felt heavier. It was no longer a small ache in the stomach. It spread into the arms, the legs, and the mind. A man who worked with stone or wood burned thousands of calories without knowing the word for it. By nightfall, his body demanded payment. And Rome answered with junk food. The same bowls, the same smells, the same thin comfort. But something deeper was happening, something no Roman could see. Day after day, the food they ate was filling, but weak. It calmed hunger without building strength. Over time, this had consequences. People grew tired faster. Wounds healed more slowly. Illness lingered longer. Bones weakened quietly. Teeth rotted early. Skin grew pale under the Mediterranean sun. Yet no one blamed the food. They blamed age. They blamed fate. They blamed the gods. Roman writers occasionally mentioned weakness among the poor, but they did so with distance. As if it were natural. As if some people were simply meant to be fragile. But fragility was being cooked daily in clay pots. Children raised on street food often grew up shorter than their parents. Many suffered from stomach problems that never truly went away. They learned to live with discomfort. Pain became background noise. Women, especially, suffered quietly. Their bodies demanded nutrients that junk food could not provide. Pregnancy was dangerous. Childbirth even more so. Yet the diet never changed. Because there was no alternative. Junk food also shaped habits. People ate quickly. Standing, alone or in silence. There was no joy in meals for the poor. No shared table. No slow conversation. Food became something mechanical. Put coin down. Take bowl. Eat. Move on. This changed how people thought about food, and about each other. Community weakened. Families rarely ate together. Parents worked long hours. Children ate when food was available, not when it was shared. Meals stopped being moments of connection. They became moments of survival. Even the body adapted. Roman doctors noticed that many people suffered from constant digestive trouble. They prescribed herbs, rest, and prayer. But they never suggested changing the diet. Because the diet was the system. To question it was to question Rome itself. There was also a quieter effect on the mind. Hunger that is never fully satisfied creates impatience, irritability, fatigue. A city fed on poor food becomes a city of short tempers and short attention. Historians often talk about Rome's violence, its cruelty, its harsh punishments. But few ask how much of that came from exhaustion, from bodies running on empty, from minds dulled by constant discomfort. Even soldiers, fed on similar rations, struggled. They were strong in training, but many suffered illness during campaigns, not from wounds, but from food. Rotten grain, spoiled meat, water mixed with sour wine. Rome conquered the world, but it did so on weak stomachs. As night deepened, people returned to their insulae, carrying the effects of their meals with them. Some slept heavily, their bodies crashing from exhaustion. Others lay awake, stomachs burning, minds restless. And the Thermopylae closed their shutters once again. The stone counters cooled, the clay pots emptied, the smells faded, but the damage remained, slow, invisible, daily. In the final section of this chapter, we will see why Rome never fixed this problem, and how junk food became so normal that no one imagined life without it. Why Rome never changed what it ate. As the night grew deeper, ancient Rome settled into a familiar rhythm. Windows darkened, doors closed, the last footsteps echoed and faded. Tomorrow would come soon enough. And when it did, Rome would eat the same way again. This was not because Romans were foolish. It was because the system left no room for change. Food in Rome was not just nourishment. It was power. Grain shipments fed the city, and whoever controlled them controlled the people. Politicians understood this well. Emperors understood it even better. So long as the population was fed enough to survive, there was no urgency to improve quality. Hunger was dangerous. Weak food was not. The government provided grain to citizens through distributions called the annona. But this grain was often old, poorly stored, or mixed with impurities. Still, people were grateful. Gratitude silences questions. Once the grain was handed out, what people did with it was their problem. Most sold it cheaply or traded it for prepared food. Cooking at home remained risky and impractical. The city itself pushed people toward junk food. Thermopylae were efficient. They reduced fires. They kept streets busy. They created jobs. No one wanted to close them. Even the wealthy depended on them indirectly. Slaves and servants often ate street food, even when working in rich households. Junk food fed Rome from the bottom up. Changing the diet would require better housing, safer cooking spaces, clean water, food storage systems. Rome had the wealth to do these things, but not the will. The empire focused on conquest, monuments, and spectacle. Food was meant to keep people quiet, not healthy. And so, generation after generation grew up believing this was normal. A bowl in the street. A quick meal. A tired body. It became tradition. Roman writers joked about bad food. Poets mocked cheap meals. Philosophers praised simple eating as a virtue. But no one demanded better. Those who could afford it escaped into private kitchens and dining rooms. Those who could not adapted. Human bodies are remarkably patient. They survive long after they should protest. By the time weakness became obvious, it was blamed on moral failure rather than diet. People were called lazy, soft, corrupted. The food was never accused. As Rome aged, the gap between rich and poor grew wider. The diet gap grew with it. Luxury feasts became more extreme. Street food became more empty. Yet the system continued. Because it worked, just enough. As dawn approached once more, bakers prepared cheap loaves. Vendors filled their pots. Workers rose with stiff limbs and empty stomachs. Another day, another bowl, another quiet cost. Rome did not fall because of junk food. But junk food did not help. It weakened bodies, dulled minds, shortened lives. And it did so quietly, without rebellion, without protest, without noise. As the city drifted toward sleep again, the streets waited patiently for the next wave of hunger. And in those clay pots, Rome continued to feed itself. Just enough to survive, but never enough to truly live. The dark secret of Roman bread. When the food that kept Rome alive slowly hurt it. Bread was everywhere in ancient Rome. It was in the hands of children walking barefoot through dusty streets. It was carried by workers on their way to construction sites. It was stacked in baskets outside bakeries before sunrise. If Rome had a heartbeat, it sounded like bread being broken. To most Romans, bread was life itself. But few ever asked what that bread was really made of. Before the city fully woke each morning, bakers were already at work. Their shops were hot, smoky, and loud, even in the early hours. Large stone mills turned slowly, powered by animals or enslaved people walking in endless circles. Grain poured between heavy stones, crushed again and again until it became flour. Or something close to flour. The problem was not effort. The problem was purity. Roman grain arrived from across the empire, Egypt, North Africa, Sicily. It traveled long distances by ship, wagon, and foot. Along the way, it collected dust, sand, pebbles, insects. There were no modern sieves. No quality controls. Only rough methods and tired hands. Much of what Romans called flour was mixed with whatever had survived the journey. Small stones were common, so common that Romans barely noticed them. Teeth cracked early in life. Jaw pain was expected. Chewing carefully became a habit learned young. Bread was rough on the body, but it filled the stomach. And that was enough. To stretch supplies further, some millers added fillers. Not always out of cruelty. Often out of necessity. Ground legumes, cheap bran, even sawdust, according to some ancient writers. When grain was scarce, anything that looked like flour became flour. The bread baked from it was heavy and dark. Dense enough to sink in water. Hard enough to bruise fingers. But it kept hunger away, for a while. The poorest Romans received government grain rations. On paper, this was generosity. In reality, it was survival-level feeding. The grain was often old. Stored badly. Sometimes moldy. People learned to cut away dark patches and eat the rest. Mold was not feared. Hunger was. Bakeries worked non-stop. Fires burned day and night. Bread was baked quickly, often unevenly. Burned crusts. Raw centers. No one complained. If you didn't buy it, someone else would. Children were sent to stand in bread lines early in the morning. Sometimes they waited for hours. Sometimes the bread ran out. On those days, families went hungry. Bread was so important that riots broke out when supplies failed. Rome could survive bad emperors, high taxes, even defeat. But not empty bread baskets. And so, bread became political. Leaders promised it. Crowds demanded it. Soldiers protected it. Yet no one talked about quality. Only quantity mattered. Doctors noticed strange illnesses among the poor. Weakness. Swollen bellies. Constant fatigue. They blamed bad air, bad morals, bad luck. But the truth was quieter. Bread filled bellies while starving bodies. Nutrients were lost during poor milling. Fiber replaced substance. Fillers replaced grain. People ate more bread to feel full, making the problem worse. It was a cycle. The more bread they ate, the weaker they became. The weaker they became, the more bread they needed. Even the rich were not immune. Their bread was whiter, softer, better sifted. But it still came from the same system. The same mills. The same grain. The same dust-filled process. Only the worst bread was reserved for the poor. By nightfall, leftovers hardened like stone. Families soaked them in water or wine to make them chewable again. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be. Bread shaped Rome's daily rhythm. It determined moods, strength, and patience. A city fed on rough bread became a city accustomed to discomfort. And discomfort, when accepted long enough, feels normal. As the lamps dimmed and homes grew quiet, breadcrumbs scattered across floors and streets. Tomorrow, more grain would arrive. More bread would be baked. And Rome would continue eating its most important food, never realizing how much harm it carried within it. In the next chapter, we will look at something Romans drank every day, often from childhood. And how it quietly affected their bodies and minds. Wine for everyone, even children. Part 1: The drink that never left Roman hands. In ancient Rome, water was never trusted. It flowed through the city in grand aqueducts, carried across miles of stone arches, admired by travelers from every corner of the empire. But admiration did not mean safety. Water could look clean and still make you sick. Pipes were old. Storage was open. Wells collected dust, insects, and waste. No one truly understood bacteria, but everyone understood the results. Stomach pain, fever, weakness. And so, Rome turned to something else. Wine. Wine was not a luxury. It was a habit. It was a solution. From the richest senator to the poorest child, wine touched nearly every Roman life, every single day. But this was not the wine we imagine today. It was weak, often sour, almost always diluted. Pure wine was considered dangerous. Drinking it without water was seen as uncivilized, even barbaric. Romans believed strong wine heated the body too much, disturbed the mind, and led to chaos. So they mixed it, sometimes 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Sometimes more, sometimes less. The mixture depended on taste, money, and availability. Children drank it too, not as a treat, not as a celebration, but because it felt safer than water. A child's cup might contain only a trace of wine, but that trace mattered. It killed some impurities. It changed the taste. It made the drink familiar. And familiarity creates trust. Roman children grew up knowing the smell of wine before they learned to read. They tasted it at meals, at celebrations, at funerals. It was always there. Wine was given to slaves, to soldiers, to workers. It was part of payment, part of rations, part of routine. A laborer expected wine the way a modern worker expects a lunch break. Without it, the day felt incomplete. But this constant drinking came at a cost, one that unfolded slowly, quietly, over years. Most Roman wine was poorly made. Grapes were crushed by foot, often without washing. Fermentation happened in open containers. Dust, insects, and debris settled freely. To preserve wine longer, Romans added substances that today would alarm us. Resin, salt, herbs, and sometimes, lead. Lead was sweet, and sweetness improved bad wine. Lead-lined containers and lead additives slowly poisoned those who drank from them regularly. But no one knew. The symptoms were vague: headaches, mood changes, stomach pain, fatigue, things Romans already accepted as normal parts of life. Wine was also used to dull hunger. A diluted cup could quiet the stomach for hours. For the poor, this mattered. A little wine in the morning, a little at midday, a little at night. Food was stretched, hunger was postponed, but nourishment was not replaced. Wine carried calories but not strength. Over time, this weakened bodies, especially young ones. Children raised on watered wine often showed signs of delayed growth. Roman writers noticed it, but shrugged. They blamed soft living. They never blamed the drink. As the sun climbed higher in the Roman sky, wine flowed freely in taverns, homes, and streets. Not enough to cause chaos. Just enough to blur the edges of hunger and exhaustion. Rome was not drunk. Rome was sedated. In the next part of this chapter, we will look at how wine shaped Roman behavior, discipline, and even violence, not suddenly, but slowly, like a fog settling over the empire. A calm city, softened by wine. As the day moved forward in ancient Rome, wine followed closely behind. It appeared at every pause in the day. After work, before rest, during meals. It was never announced, never celebrated. It was simply there. Romans believed wine brought balance. Mixed properly, it was thought to cool anger, soften grief, and steady the mind. Philosophers spoke of moderation, praising wine when it was watered down and consumed slowly. And most of the time, it was. Rome was not a city of loud drunks stumbling through streets at noon. That image belonged to outsiders and enemies in Roman stories. Instead, Rome was quietly softened. Wine smoothed the sharp edges of daily life. For a worker, a cup of diluted wine after labor eased aching muscles. It relaxed the body just enough to continue. It made fatigue tolerable. For a soldier, wine dulled fear. It helped sleep come faster in unfamiliar places. It made distance from home easier to bear. For a slave, wine offered a brief escape, a warmth in the chest that made long hours feel slightly shorter. And for children, wine was simply normal. They watched adults drink it calmly. They learned early that it was not forbidden, not exciting, not dangerous. Just ordinary. This is how habits become invisible. But even gentle habits leave marks. Wine affected Roman discipline in subtle ways. It did not make people wild, but it made them slower. Slower to react, slower to heal, slower to resist illness. Roman doctors often warned against excess, but excess was rarely defined clearly. One person's moderation was another's daily reliance. Wine was also used as medicine. Mixed with herbs, it treated pain. Mixed with honey, it soothed coughs. Mixed with vinegar, it cleaned wounds. It seemed to cure everything. So when it caused harm, no one suspected it. Mood changes were common in Rome. Irritability, sadness, sudden anger. Philosophers blamed moral weakness. Poets blamed love. Politicians blamed enemies. But wine quietly shaped emotions. Daily drinking, even diluted, affected sleep. People slept deeply at first, then restlessly. Dreams became vivid. Waking brought fog. A fog that never fully lifted. Over years, this became the Roman baseline. Slight exhaustion. Slight impatience. Slight numbness. Rome was not collapsing. It was drifting. Even violence was influenced. Wine was present at arguments, negotiations, punishments, and celebrations. It softened some conflicts, but sharpened others. A cup too many could turn frustration into cruelty. But because wine was everywhere, its influence was never isolated. No single moment could be blamed. Only patterns. Children raised around wine learned to associate comfort with it. Stress. Wine helped. Hunger. Wine delayed it. Sadness. Wine warmed it. By adulthood, reaching for a cup felt natural. Necessary. And still, no alarms rang. Rome continued building, marching, ruling, all while gently dulled. As afternoon light faded, taverns filled quietly. Not with chaos, but with murmurs. Conversations slowed. Movements relaxed. A city settling into itself. In the next part, we will explore the hidden dangers inside Roman wine. Not from drunkenness, but from what Romans added to it, and stored it in, without ever knowing the cost. Hidden dangers in every cup. As the evening deepened, the presence of wine in Rome remained constant. But behind its familiar taste, dangers quietly waited. Lead was one of the most common threats. Lead-lined containers preserved wine and gave it a sweetness that masked poor fermentation. It improved flavor. It reduced spoilage. But it also poisoned slowly. The effects were subtle. Romans did not collapse suddenly. They did not scream or run in terror. Instead, they became slightly weaker. Minds dulled. Appetites shifted. Bones sometimes softened. Leaders unknowingly consumed the same wine. Senators, emperors, generals, many drank from lead vessels. Their decisions, health, and longevity may have been quietly affected over years. For the general population, the danger blended with hunger and fatigue. Weakness was normal. Cravings for stronger wine or more food were normal. The pattern became routine. Watered wine did not cause sudden death. It caused survival. It carried calories but no real strength. It carried warmth but not health. Children absorbed this pattern from birth. They grew used to waking up with the slight fog of fermented sweetness. They learned that warmth in the chest and relief in the stomach came from a cup, not from food. And that reliance shaped a lifetime. Wounds healed slower. Growth was stunted. Fatigue lingered longer. Yet no one noticed. And that was the brilliance, and danger, of Rome's wine culture. It was normal. It was expected. It was quiet. By nightfall, Rome's streets smelled faintly of wine. Taverns glowed softly. Slaves and workers carried small cups home, leaving gentle trails of warmth behind. For the city as a whole, this created a soft, muted rhythm. People were calmer than hunger alone would allow. They were more patient than exhaustion demanded. They tolerated discomfort better than nature intended. But they were also subtly compromised. Bodies were slightly weaker. Minds slightly dulled. Energy slightly less. And yet, Rome thrived. Empire expanded. Roads were built. Monuments rose. All while daily life quietly depended on wine. Not just as a drink, but as a medicine, a food substitute, and a crutch. No one called it dangerous. It was simply life. And as lamps flickered in the early night, the city settled into silence. Wine had softened its people once again, carrying them gently toward sleep, toward rest, toward another day that would begin with wine, bread, and hunger. In the next part, we will look at how daily wine consumption intertwined with the foods Romans ate, and how that combination shaped not only bodies but entire societies in ways almost no historian mentions, how wine and food worked together. As the city of Rome moved through another long day, wine was rarely alone. It flowed alongside bread, porridge, beans, and whatever scraps could be found in Thermopylae. Together, they formed a quiet routine that shaped every life. Breakfast was often a slice of hard bread softened in water or diluted wine. A child might nibble it slowly while sipping another small cup, unaware that both food and drink were only partially nourishing. By midday, workers relied on the same combination. A quick porridge or a few beans were eaten while drinking more diluted wine, enough to feel warmth and fullness. Fatigue receded slightly, hunger was postponed, and labor continued. Evening meals were similar. Bread soaked in wine, leftovers reheated, perhaps a small bit of meat, if lucky. Another cup of weak wine to help digestion and sleep. This pattern, repeated daily, created habits that lasted a lifetime. Wine carried calories and comfort, but it did not repair the body. Food filled the stomach, but often lacked nutrients. Together, they masked the effects of poor diet, hiding weakness behind warmth and fullness. This combination shaped more than bodies, it shaped minds. People became used to delayed hunger. Bodies adjusted to partial nutrition. Mental energy ebbed slowly, creating patience in some, irritability in others. The fog of slow fatigue was normal. Romans rarely noticed it because it was universal. Children grew accustomed to the taste of wine and the texture of stale or mixed foods. Their growth and development were subtly affected, but no one thought twice. It was just the way life was. Even social habits were influenced. Meals were no longer moments of joy but acts of endurance. Conversations were brief. Energy was low. Families and workers learned to function with just enough food and wine to keep moving. Yet, the city itself appeared vibrant and alive. Markets bustled. Roads were traveled. Work continued. Rome expanded. Life went on, quietly carried by this strange partnership between wine and food. Health issues were common but rarely blamed on diet. Stomachs ached, energy waned, teeth rotted, bones weakened. Doctors prescribed herbs or rest. Philosophers prescribed moderation and discipline. Religion prescribed sacrifice and prayer. Wine and food were never accused. They remained allies in survival, quietly shaping lives and bodies without anyone realizing the cumulative effects. As night fell, lamps glimmered softly, shadows stretched across the streets, and the smell of wine lingered in homes and taverns. Romans drank, ate, and rested, ready to repeat the cycle tomorrow. In the next part, we will explore how this constant dependence on wine influenced Roman culture, social behavior, and the empire's ability to maintain control, all in ways historians seldom focus on: wine, society, and control. As night deepened in ancient Rome, wine's presence extended beyond individual bodies, it shaped society itself. Leaders understood the power of daily wine consumption. They knew that when the population was quietly sedated, unrest was less likely. Hunger could cause riots, sudden violence, or rebellion. Wine softened the edges of hunger without removing it, keeping people obedient and functional. Even small amounts, given routinely, created a calm rhythm in the city. Workers and slaves performed long, grueling hours. Soldiers marched and guarded distant borders. Citizens queued for bread distributions. Wine ensured that they did all of this without excessive complaint. In homes, the poor relied on it for warmth and comfort. In taverns, gossip spread gently, and disputes rarely escalated into serious fights. Wine acted as a mediator, a buffer between fatigue and frustration. Yet this quiet power came at a cost. The population remained dependent on a system designed to provide minimal sustenance. Wine delayed hunger but could not replace nutrition. Bread filled bellies but lacked essential vitamins and minerals. Beans and porridge supplemented diets, but only partially. Over generations, this subtle compromise became normalized. Children drank wine. Adults continued the pattern. Weakness became ordinary. Patience became necessity. Complaints and resistance became rare. The effect reached even beyond health. Wine shaped thought, judgment, and culture. Philosophers occasionally remarked on laziness, forgetfulness, or moral weakness, but rarely traced it to diet and alcohol. The subtle sedation of the populace was invisible precisely because it was everywhere. Roman festivals, religious ceremonies, and celebrations also relied on wine. Rituals involved drinking small amounts, reinforcing the habit. People learned to associate comfort, divinity, and social belonging with the taste and warmth of wine. By making dependence socially and culturally acceptable, wine became part of identity. It was more than a beverage, it was a tool of survival, a marker of civilization, and a quiet instrument of social control. Even in warfare, wine played a role. Soldiers were given diluted wine to calm nerves, provide minimal calories, and maintain discipline. Armies marched and conquered, fueled in part by the sedative consistency of the drink. Fatigue was masked, weakness was postponed, hunger was deferred, yet the empire itself was subtly weakened. Bodies slowed. Minds dulled. The combination of minimal nutrition and constant low-level sedation created a population that could survive, but rarely thrive. As night fell deeper over Rome, the last lamps flickered. Taverns closed. Homes quieted. Wine's presence lingered in the air and in the blood of citizens, silently shaping the next day's behavior and the generation to come. In the next part of this chapter, we will examine specific stories of Roman families, children, and workers, showing how their daily relationship with wine subtly influenced their lives, bodies, and destinies, lives quietly shaped by wine. In the small apartments of Rome, daily life moved slowly under the influence of wine. Children awoke with faint traces of the previous night's drink in their systems, often before the sun fully rose. A mother would give them a small cup, barely enough to taste, while preparing bread softened in water or leftover porridge. This combination quieted stomachs and gave a sense of fullness, but it did not nourish. Workers carried their midday cups of diluted wine to construction sites. The liquid offered comfort, warmth, and a temporary relief from exhaustion. They drank quietly, standing among stones, wood, and the steady clatter of tools. Even at festivals or public events, wine's presence was subtle yet constant. People did not stagger drunkenly through the streets as modern imagination might suggest. Instead, they were calm, compliant, and slightly dulled. Conversations were gentle. Arguments cooled quickly. Discomfort faded into the background. For families, wine became a shared ritual. It bridged hunger, fatigue, and tension. Parents and children both participated, reinforcing the habit across generations. It was ordinary, expected, and rarely questioned. Over time, the subtle influence of wine shaped behavior. Irritability decreased. Patience increased. But so did dependence. Bodies became accustomed to low-level sedation, and hunger became manageable rather than urgent. People survived, but rarely thrived. Even minor illnesses were quietly exacerbated by the regular consumption of wine. Weakness became normalized. Fatigue was constant. Children grew up smaller and less resilient than they might have in a fully nourishing environment. Adults aged faster. Their energy waned slowly, almost imperceptibly. Yet the pattern persisted. Wine was inexpensive, available, and deeply ingrained in culture. It provided comfort and stability while quietly shaping the population. It masked weakness without correcting it. In Rome's busy streets, this quiet influence extended to social hierarchy. Wealthy citizens drank wine too, but theirs was better, purer, and often undiluted. The poor drank watered-down versions, just enough to sustain them. The subtle difference reinforced social gaps, teaching dependence while highlighting disparity. By nightfall, the effects of the day's consumption lingered. Sleep came easily, aided by wine's warmth, but it was never truly restorative. Dreams were deep but sometimes restless. Bodies relaxed, minds dulled, and the cycle was ready to begin again tomorrow. In the next part, we will explore the long-term effects of lifelong wine consumption, how it shaped Roman health, behavior, and society in ways historians rarely emphasize. Long-term effects and quiet influence. As the years passed, Rome's dependence on wine became a silent rhythm that shaped generations. Children who grew up drinking watered wine carried the habit into adulthood. Their bodies adapted, but not perfectly. Bones were sometimes weaker than they might have been. Energy levels were subdued. Digestion was slower. Adults, too, were affected. Daily wine consumption masked fatigue, hunger, and illness. Work continued, cities functioned, and families survived, but few ever reached full physical potential. The warm, slightly numbing effect of wine became a constant companion, a subtle partner in survival. Historians rarely notice this. They write of wars, conquests, political intrigue, and monumental architecture. But they seldom pause to consider the quiet shaping of an entire population by a common drink. Wine also influenced social behavior. Arguments were softened, tempers cooled, and fatigue became tolerable. People tolerated long hours, poor housing, and insufficient food. Discontent existed, but it rarely boiled over into rebellion because wine dulled urgency without removing hunger. Even festivals and ceremonies reinforced this subtle control. Wine was everywhere, present in ritual and celebration, marking social cohesion and shared experience. Its ubiquity normalized dependence, making it feel ordinary rather than necessary. The empire expanded, maintained, and governed largely because the population could endure. Bodies and minds were softened, Yes, but just enough to keep the wheels of Rome turning. Yet this came at a cost. Lifelong wine consumption contributed to chronic weakness. Illnesses lingered. Recovery from injury slowed. Fatigue was constant, and life expectancy was affected. These were not dramatic collapses, they were quiet, cumulative effects, almost invisible over a lifetime. By nightfall, Rome slept under a canopy of lamps and stars, softened by the ritual of daily wine. The streets were silent. Families rested, bodies relaxed, and minds eased. Hunger was temporarily postponed. Exhaustion was dulled. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. Bread and porridge, beans and scraps, diluted wine, all part of the slow, continuous rhythm of survival. Rome continued, quietly sustained by habits that shaped its population from childhood to old age. Wine was everywhere, harmless in the moment, powerful in the long term, and utterly ordinary in the lives of Romans. And so the empire thrived, not because people were at their strongest, but because they could endure. The city, the people, and the empire were quietly molded, one cup at a time. As the lamps dimmed and the night deepened, the citizens of Rome drifted toward sleep, carrying warmth in their chests and the silent influence of wine in their veins. The story of wine was not one of spectacle or sudden disaster. It was subtle, pervasive, and enduring, just like the empire it helped sustain, the mystery meat of Rome. How Romans ate meat, often without knowing what it really was. In ancient Rome, meat was a rare luxury for most people. For the wealthy, it appeared in lavish feasts, roasted haunches, whole birds, exotic imports, but for the majority of Romans, meat was a mystery. It was something they encountered occasionally, often at street stalls or during festivals, and it was never guaranteed to be fresh. Most Roman meals were plant-based. Bread, porridge, beans, lentils, and vegetables made up the daily diet. Meat appeared only as scraps, leftovers, or parts that could not be sold elsewhere. This, mystery meat, was often processed into sausages, stews, or boiled with spices and sauces. These dishes hid the origin of the meat, the age of the animal, and sometimes even what animal it had been. Vendors rarely explained what they were selling. Customers rarely asked. Hunger is louder than curiosity. Sausages were especially common. They were made from ground meat mixed with fat, grains, spices, and sometimes other ingredients that would not normally be eaten. These mixtures were shaped into links or patties, cooked over hot coals, and sold quickly. The flavor was strong, designed to mask anything unpleasant. Spices, salt, and even fermented fish sauces like garum were added liberally. Street food vendors aimed to sell quickly. Safety, freshness, and hygiene were secondary. Meat was often reused, reheated, or kept in warm clay pots for hours. What was edible one hour might be questionable the next. Even bread occasionally contained small pieces of meat. Bakers and vendors stretched every ingredient to feed more mouths. The poorer the customer, the more likely their meat came from leftovers or scraps. Children, standing in line with their parents, ate these dishes without thought. They learned early that meat was rare and not always clean. Their taste buds adapted to strong flavors, masking decay or unusual textures. Slaves and laborers relied on this food for energy. It was heavy, calorie-dense, and cheap. But it was not necessarily nourishing. Protein came in small, inconsistent amounts. Contamination was a constant risk. Surprisingly, Romans often considered this normal. Weakness, stomach pain, and fatigue were accepted as part of daily life. Food was functional, not pleasurable. Even during public feasts, meat was sometimes served in ways designed to impress rather than sustain. The wealthy consumed prime cuts. The poor received scraps or heavily seasoned dishes that disguised the age and quality of the meat. This created a quiet social distinction. Who ate what was a marker of status. And yet, everyone depended on meat in some form, because protein was necessary to endure daily labor. The smell of roasting meat filled the streets, mingling with smoke, bread, and wine. It was enticing but unreliable. Vendors moved quickly, and customers learned to eat fast, standing in alleys or near thermopylae counters. Over time, this dependence on uncertain protein shaped Roman bodies. Muscle development was limited for the poor. Growth was stunted in some children. Illnesses lingered longer. Yet hunger drove people to continue eating, trusting the familiar scents and flavors. Meat consumption also influenced social behavior. It was a small reward, a rare treat, and a reason to gather. Eating even quickly and imperfectly, became part of community life. Sharing a bowl or a piece of sausage built connections, reinforced survival habits, and maintained social order. In the next part of this chapter, we will explore specific examples of mystery meats, the unusual ingredients, preparation methods, and stories behind what Romans ate without ever fully knowing, strange ingredients and unseen additions. As we step closer to understanding Roman mystery meat, it becomes clear that meat was rarely simple. Vendors used every part of an animal. Bones, fat, skin, and organ meat were ground, chopped, or boiled into stews and sausages. These ingredients were rarely listed. Customers did not ask. Hunger left no time for inspection. Odd cuts, previously considered waste, found their way into meals. Feet, ears, and heads were sometimes cooked slowly to extract flavor and nutrients. Soft tissues from these parts were mixed with grains, herbs, and sometimes fermented fish sauce to mask unusual textures. Spices played a critical role. Pepper, cumin, and coriander were sprinkled liberally. They served more than flavor, they disguised aging meat, uneven cooking, and inconsistent quality. A heavily spiced sausage could be sold with confidence, even if the contents were questionable. Sometimes, mystery meat contained leftovers from previous meals. Vendors reused scraps. Soups were reheated multiple times. Stews simmered for hours, slowly blending flavors and obscuring origin. Roman records and recipes hint at more unusual practices. Some wealthy households even experimented with exotic additives, honey, wine, and vinegar, to enhance flavor or preserve meat. In street foods, simpler versions used salt and garum. Preservation was not about nutrition, it was about sales. Children, laborers, and slaves consumed these dishes daily. They developed tolerance to strong flavors. Their palates adjusted to textures and smells that would challenge modern diners. Over time, they rarely questioned the source of their meals. The routine of eating was survival, not curiosity. Meat also served social functions. Even a small piece symbolized strength and vitality. Laborers felt satisfied after a meat-containing meal. Children learned to associate it with occasional reward. Feasts celebrated wealth and status, even while poorer Romans ate heavily seasoned mystery meat. This combination of necessity, flavor, and scarcity ensured that meat maintained a quiet but powerful role in Roman culture. Hunger drove consumption. Flavor masked uncertainty. Social norms reinforced the habit. Yet, this reliance had consequences. Poor quality protein contributed to slow growth in children, weakness in adults, and fatigue in laborers. Disease spread more easily when food was stored poorly or cooked inadequately. And yet, these effects were invisible to most observers, masked by the sheer resilience of human bodies. By evening, Thermopylae and street vendors prepared for another day. Meat stews were reheated. Sausages were sliced and sold. The city's rhythm continued, maintained by the familiar smells of cooking meat, bread, and wine. In the next part, we will explore how this mystery meat intersected with festivals, religious rituals, and daily survival, revealing the cultural significance behind what most people would call junk food. Festivals, rituals, and daily survival. As Rome's days and nights continued, meat, especially mystery meat, played a quiet but persistent role in the rhythm of life. During festivals, religious ceremonies, and public celebrations, meat appeared in slightly larger quantities. Sometimes roasted, sometimes boiled, it was shared among citizens in streets, temples, and markets. For the poor, this was a rare taste of abundance. For the wealthy, it was an opportunity to display status and generosity. Yet even during these events, mystery meat retained its secretive nature. What exactly was served was rarely specified. Vendors and cooks relied on spices, sauces, and presentation to disguise aging, reused, or unusual ingredients. Crowds ate quickly, enjoying warmth and flavor while rarely questioning the source. Daily survival dictated behavior. Street vendors sold what was available, inexpensive, and filling. Hunger overshadowed concern. Meat was less about enjoyment and more about enduring the day's labor. A small portion of protein, however uncertain, gave enough strength to continue work, build structures, carry goods, and walk long distances. Children observed and learned. They grew accustomed to eating whatever was offered, developing tolerance for strong flavors and unfamiliar textures. They associated meat with occasional pleasure, warmth, and survival. Over time, it became normal, expected, and unquestioned. Adults, too, relied on these meals. Weakness, fatigue, and stomach discomfort were common but accepted as part of life. Even the occasional illness caused by poor quality meat was considered natural or a minor inconvenience. The social function of mystery meat was also important. Sharing a bowl or piece of meat created temporary community bonds. Workers and neighbors ate side by side, quietly supporting one another through shared survival. Festivals amplified this effect, combining ritual, sustenance, and social cohesion. Despite the risks, Romans rarely complained. The routine of eating was survival itself. People adapted to what they could get. Palates adjusted, bodies endured, and minds accepted the subtle compromise. Hunger was controlled. Strength was partial. Life continued. Over time, mystery meat left lasting effects. Growth in children was sometimes slower than optimal. Adults carried fatigue into labor and military service. Bones, teeth, and digestion reflected a lifetime of uneven nutrition. Yet resilience was remarkable. Romans survived despite minimal protein and inconsistent quality. By nightfall, Thermopylae emptied. Streets cooled. The smell of roasted, boiled, and spiced meat lingered in alleys. Families returned home, carrying warmth, calories, and the subtle comfort of routine. Rome thrived on this system, reliant on mystery meat, bread, porridge, and diluted wine. Survival depended on routine, adaptability, and quiet acceptance. The empire grew, expanded, and endured, even as daily diets were far from optimal. And so, mystery meat remained a silent partner in Roman life, ubiquitous, practical, disguised, and shaping generations without ever demanding attention. The street food of Rome, Thermopylae's secrets. How Romans ate on the go. In ancient Rome, streets were never quiet. Merchants shouted. Children ran. Animals moved in every direction. But among all the noise, one sound dominated the rhythm of daily life, the clatter of pots and trays from the Thermopylae. Thermopylae were small, open-fronted shops scattered throughout the city. They sold ready-to-eat meals for people who could not afford to cook at home, or had no time. For the majority of Romans, these shops were lifelines. The Thermopylae offered food quickly. Bread, porridge, beans, small portions of meat, and fermented fish sauce were common. Food was displayed in clay containers set into counters, steam rising from the pots, inviting passers-by to eat immediately. These shops were practical. Kitchens were rare in apartments. Cooking at home was dangerous, slow, and expensive. Fires could spread quickly in crowded insulae. Thermopylae solved the problem. They provided warmth, sustenance, and convenience. Yet, the system had secrets. Vendors reused ingredients. Stews simmered for hours, sometimes overnight. Bread became soggy or hardened, then was soaked again in water or wine. Meat was reheated. Fish sauce was added liberally. The goal was simple: maximize quantity while minimizing waste. Cleanliness was minimal. Clay pots were rinsed quickly. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Spices, vinegar, and garum masked odor and taste. What looked appetizing could be old, reused, or barely safe. Customers rarely asked questions. Hunger outweighed caution. Quick meals meant more energy to work, travel, or perform daily tasks. For children, workers, and slaves, Thermopylae were essential. A hot bowl of porridge or a sausage link could sustain them for hours. The street food culture also shaped social life. People ate while standing. Conversations were brief. Transactions were fast. The act of eating became mechanical, functional, and habitual. Meals were consumed alone or in quiet clusters, not at leisurely tables. Even the city's rhythm depended on Thermopylae. Workers relied on morning porridge. Artisans paused at midday. Soldiers, travelers, and laborers sought warm, quick meals as they moved between tasks. The city functioned around these small shops, quietly sustaining the population. Yet Thermopylae also reflected the inequalities of Rome. Wealthy citizens could afford private kitchens, fresh ingredients, and luxury meals. The poor depended on reused scraps, heavily seasoned dishes, and thin porridge. Survival depended on efficiency, not quality. By evening, Thermopylae prepared for the night crowd. Pots were refilled. Bread was broken. Sausages were sliced. The smells of food mingled with wine, smoke, and the city's stone and dust. Despite the minimal comfort, Thermopylae ensured survival. People were fed, streets remained busy, and the city moved forward. Rome endured, built, and expanded, not because meals were nourishing, but because food was available, cheap, and convenient. In the next part of this chapter, we will explore the hidden dangers, daily routines, and stories behind Thermopylae, revealing why these street kitchens were both lifelines and quiet risks for Romans. Hidden dangers and daily routines. Thermopylae fed the city, but they were far from perfect. The ingredients were often old. Vegetables wilted. Meat was reused or barely cooked. Fish sauce covered. Smells, and spices disguised textures. Clay pots held food for hours, sometimes all day. Water for cleaning was scarce and not always clean. Yet Romans rarely complained. Hunger dictated behavior. A hot, heavy bowl was enough to continue the day. The smell of food, steam rising in narrow alleys, invited people to eat quickly and move on. Efficiency mattered more than taste or safety. Daily routines revolved around Thermopylae. Workers ate quickly before starting labor. Children grabbed small portions on their way to chores. Slaves waited patiently for scraps to supplement their minimal rations. Meals were functional, not social. These street kitchens also reinforced social norms. Poor citizens learned to tolerate rough food, hurried consumption, and minimal comfort. Wealthy Romans rarely visited them, instead dining in private homes. The contrast reinforced inequality. The rich could enjoy leisure and quality, while the poor adapted to survival. Thermopylae also carried subtle dangers beyond hygiene. Food could be contaminated. Overcooked or improperly stored meat could cause illness. Bread and porridge, softened repeatedly, sometimes harbored bacteria. Drinking wine diluted water helped, but did not eliminate risk. Even so, Thermopylae were indispensable. They saved lives. They allowed the city to function. Workers could continue labor, soldiers could march, and children could grow. Despite weak nutrition and occasional sickness, the system worked, slowly, quietly, and efficiently. The atmosphere in Thermopylae was always hurried but strangely comforting. The clatter of pots, low conversation, and warmth of food provided structure. For many Romans, these small shops represented stability in a city of chaos. By evening, Thermopylae closed or prepared for night customers. Clay pots cooled. Steam faded. The smell of hot food lingered in alleys. People returned home, carrying small portions of sustenance that would keep them alive until dawn. In the next part, we will examine specific meals, unusual ingredients, and the daily life of Thermopylae customers, highlighting how street food shaped survival, social behavior, and Roman culture. Meals, ingredients, and daily life. Inside the Thermopylae, meals were simple but consistent. Breakfast often consisted of pulse, a type of porridge made from boiled grains such as wheat, barley, or spelt. Sometimes leftover vegetables or small pieces of meat were added. It was filling, warm, and cheap. For children and laborers, this first meal set the tone for the day. Lunch and midday snacks relied on small portions of bread, cheese, and sausages. Vendors offered lightly spiced stews or leftover meat boiled with legumes. These meals were designed for efficiency, quick to serve, easy to eat, and calorie-dense enough to sustain long work hours. Evening meals could be richer, particularly after a festival or special occasion. Stews thickened with grains, fatty scraps, and preserved vegetables were common. Occasionally, small portions of fish, salted pork, or poultry were added if available. These dishes were heavy, flavorful, and intended to satisfy hunger before bedtime. Ingredients were carefully chosen for preservation and economy rather than taste or nutrition. Spices masked undesirable flavors, vinegar extended shelf life, and fermentation altered textures. Garlic, onions, cumin, and coriander were common additions, creating strong aromas that concealed what the dish actually contained. Customers moved quickly through Thermopylae. There were no tables for lingering meals. People ate standing, holding bowls or slices of bread in their hands. Conversations were brief, laughter rare, and meals consumed in silence or murmurs. Efficiency was a necessity, no one could afford to linger. Children observed and learned these habits early. Eating quickly became second nature. Bodies adapted to regular schedules, uneven nutrition, and sometimes spoiled ingredients. Adults reinforced these routines, passing habits down through generations. Despite these challenges, Thermopylae provided more than food. They created community rhythms. Neighbors recognized familiar vendors. Regular customers developed quiet bonds over shared meals. Streets and alleys became structured around these small hubs of survival, where sustenance and social order intertwined. Hygiene remained a concern, but adaptation was key. Water for washing was limited, food could be contaminated, and leftovers were reheated repeatedly. Yet Romans developed tolerance. Slight illness or stomach upset was expected. Survival outweighed concern for minor discomforts. By nightfall, thermopolia slowed. Clay pots cooled. Steam and aroma lingered. Vendors counted coins, prepared for the next day, and cleaned what they could. Streets emptied gradually, leaving the city ready to begin the cycle again at dawn. Thermopolia were more than food stalls. They were lifelines, social centers, and subtle regulators of Roman life. They shaped how Romans ate, how they worked, and how they survived. Through hot pots, strong spices, and hurried meals, the empire functioned. In the next part, we will explore how Thermopolia influenced Roman culture, labor, and health over generations, revealing the quiet, long-term effects of a society built around street food: influence, survival, and long-term effects. Thermopolia shaped more than daily meals, they shaped Roman life, culture, and survival. For laborers, the street food system allowed long hours of work. Quick, calorie-dense meals kept bodies moving, even when nutrition was incomplete. Children, observing and participating, learned the rhythms of survival early, adapting to irregular food quality and timing. The poor relied on Thermopolia for sustenance, while the wealthy rarely visited. This reinforced social hierarchies. The difference between a luxury meal at a private home and a hurried stew from a street counter highlighted inequality. Yet it also ensured survival. The city functioned because basic food was accessible to all, even in the simplest form. Health outcomes reflected these practices. Daily exposure to reused ingredients, poorly stored meat, and reheated dishes caused minor illnesses, digestive issues, and fatigue. Children grew up resilient but not always robust. Adults worked through tiredness, relying on repeated meals and diluted wine for energy. Despite these challenges, Thermopolia created social continuity. People knew where to go. Vendors knew their customers. Meals were predictable, reliable, and fast. Communities formed around these hubs of nourishment, sharing space, conversation, and occasional gestures of generosity. The culture of efficiency extended beyond the food itself. Eating quickly, moving on, and tolerating imperfections became habits of survival. Over time, these behaviors influenced broader social patterns. Patience, endurance, and quiet resilience became valued traits. Even festivals and public gatherings relied on Thermopolia-style preparation. Food needed to be quick, portable, and serving large numbers efficiently. Spiced, reheated, and preserved dishes mirrored daily life, reinforcing patterns established in the streets. The cumulative effect of Thermopolia was subtle but profound. Romans survived on minimal nutrition. Work continued. The city expanded. Social order remained stable. Hunger, fatigue, and minor illness were constants, yet they were accepted as part of life. By night, Thermopolia closed, streets emptied, and the aroma of bread, stew, and spices lingered in the air. The city rested, ready to repeat. The cycle of survival tomorrow. Thermopolia were not just food stalls, they were essential structures that allowed Rome to endure. They provided sustenance, regulated behavior, and maintained social cohesion. They shaped bodies, habits, and even culture, quietly ensuring the continuity of an empire built on efficiency, routine, and survival. Ancient Roman snacks and sweets. How Romans indulged between meals. In ancient Rome, meals were often simple, functional, and focused on survival. But even in a society built around bread, porridge, and occasional meat, people found ways to enjoy small pleasures, snacks and sweets. Snacks were not elaborate. They were practical, portable, and designed to satisfy minor hunger between meals. Nuts, dried fruits, olives, and small pieces of cheese were common. Vendors sold them on streets, near markets, and at temples, allowing busy Romans to grab a quick bite while working, walking, or running errands. Children especially loved sweets. Honey was the primary sweetener in Rome, used generously on bread, fruits, and small cakes called globuli. Dates, figs, and raisins were mixed into pastries or eaten alone. Even though sugar as we know it did not exist, these natural sweeteners brought joy to everyday life. Nuts were another favorite. Almonds, walnuts, and hazelnuts were eaten raw or lightly roasted. They provided calories and protein, but also flavor and texture, breaking the monotony of daily bread and porridge. For children, nuts were both a treat and a tiny supplement to their diet. Olives, in addition to being nutritious, were a snack that could be stored for long periods. Salted or pickled, they offered flavor, fat, and energy for laborers and travelers. Olives were common in homes, markets, and thermopolia, blending nourishment with convenience. Street vendors sometimes sold small fried or baked pastries. These were not elaborate desserts but dense, calorie-rich snacks, often sweetened with honey or mixed with dried fruits. They were filling, easy to carry, and consumed quickly between meals. Even snacks carried subtle risks. Preservation was minimal. Honey preserved some items, but other ingredients could spoil quickly. Nuts and dried fruits sometimes became infested with insects or developed mold. Children and adults ate these items regardless, guided by hunger and the pleasure of taste. Sweets also played a role in festivals and religious rituals. Cakes, pastries, and honey-drenched treats were offered to gods, shared among participants, or sold to crowds. These foods were rare indulgences for the poor, while the wealthy enjoyed more elaborate and varied versions. The cultural role of snacks and sweets was significant. They provided small bursts of comfort and energy. They broke the monotony of simple meals and helped maintain morale. Children learned early to anticipate small pleasures, associating them with reward, celebration, and daily life. Despite their small size, snacks and sweets had a lasting effect. They influenced eating habits, taste preferences, and social behavior. Even in a world focused on survival, the human desire for flavor, sweetness, and variety persisted. By evening, small leftovers from snacks and sweets were eaten, shared, or saved. Families, children, and laborers ended the day with these minor indulgences, adding warmth and satisfaction to simple lives. In the next part of this chapter, we will explore the preparation methods, recipes, and hidden ingredients of Roman snacks, revealing how even the smallest foods reflected culture, resourcefulness, and daily survival. Preparation, recipes, and hidden ingredients. Roman snacks and sweets were simple, but preparation often required skill and ingenuity. Dried fruits like figs, dates, and raisins were eaten alone or mixed with nuts. They were sometimes rolled in honey or ground into paste to create small cakes called globuli. These treats were portable, easy to store, and provided quick energy for children, workers, and travelers. Nuts were roasted lightly to bring out flavor. They could be eaten plain or mixed with honey, creating a sticky, dense snack that lasted long hours on the streets or during labor. Even the simplest snack carried calories, fat, and energy necessary for survival. Pastries were made from dough of wheat or barley flour, often enriched with honey or oil. Small, dense cakes were baked or fried in olive oil. The aroma drew children and adults alike. Sometimes, dried fruits were hidden inside pastries to add sweetness or variety. Cheese was another popular snack. Fresh, soft cheeses were eaten with bread or honey, providing protein and fat. Harder cheeses were stored and sliced in small pieces, perfect for carrying between meals. Olives were preserved in brine or oil. They were eaten as is or added to small dishes. Their salty taste complemented otherwise bland meals, offering flavor and minimal calories. Even small snacks carried hidden dangers. Honey preserved some items, but other ingredients could spoil. Nuts and dried fruits occasionally became infested or moldy. Bread left out too long became stale or attracted pests. Romans adapted to these risks, eating what was available, often accepting minor discomforts as part of life. Sweets and snacks were also tied to rituals and social life. Festivals featured cakes and pastries for offerings to gods. Honey-drenched globuli were shared among children during celebrations. Street vendors sold small pastries at markets and near temples, offering convenience and indulgence for those passing by. For children, these snacks were both pleasure and sustenance. They learned early to associate sweetness with reward, warmth, and comfort. For adults, snacks were functional, providing quick energy between meals, yet they also added small comforts to otherwise harsh routines. Through these small foods, Romans demonstrated ingenuity. Simple ingredients became versatile. Nothing was wasted. Dried fruits, nuts, honey, cheese, and bread were combined in creative ways, reflecting resourcefulness and the need to sustain a growing empire. By evening, leftovers from daily snacks were often consumed at home. Children nibbled on bits of honeyed bread or dried fruits before sleep. Adults shared small portions with family members, creating moments of calm, comfort, and connection amid the city's bustle. In the next part of this chapter, we will examine how these snacks influenced health, growth, and long-term survival, showing the subtle yet lasting impact of small pleasures in ancient Rome. Health, growth, and long-term impact. Even small snacks had lasting effects on Roman health and development. Children who regularly consumed honey, dried fruits, and nuts gained quick energy but did not always receive balanced nutrition. The sugar from honey provided immediate calories, while nuts added protein and fat, but essential vitamins and minerals were often missing. Growth could be uneven, and bodies were sometimes weaker than optimal. Adults benefited similarly. Quick snacks sustained them during long hours of labor, travel, or military service. They allowed work to continue, but reliance on small, calorie-dense foods meant that fatigue and minor illness were common. Nutrition was partial, energy intermittent, yet survival continued. Snacks also influenced taste and habit. Children accustomed to sweetened treats or spiced nuts developed preferences that persisted into adulthood. Flavors became familiar, comforted, and guided food choices. The enjoyment of simple pleasures created routines that shaped daily life. Social behavior, and even economic patterns. Vendors knew what sold best, families knew what children demanded, and streets followed the rhythm of consumption. Socially, snacks reinforced subtle hierarchies. Wealthy citizens enjoyed luxury treats with imported ingredients, refined flavors, and elaborate preparation. The poor consumed locally available, practical items, honey, dried fruit, nuts, and simple pastries. Yet both groups shared the human need for small pleasures. Over generations, snacks helped maintain energy, morale, and social cohesion. Children grew accustomed to small rewards. Adults survived minor hunger and fatigue. Communities shared flavors and rituals, celebrating life's small indulgences amid the harsher realities of daily existence. Even during festivals, religious ceremonies, or family gatherings, snacks created continuity. They were offered as gifts, shared among friends, or used in rituals. Their simplicity did not diminish significance. Small foods carried symbolic and practical importance simultaneously. By evening, after the main meal and perhaps one last honeyed morsel, Romans settled for the night. Children rested, adults reflected, and the city prepared for another cycle of bread, wine, mystery meat, thermopolia, and snacks. Through these small foods, Romans survived, adapted, and found quiet joy. The cumulative effect of snacks and sweets may have been subtle, but it shaped the habits, health, and culture of the population in ways that echoed through generations. Snacks were not just food, they were a tool of endurance, a source of comfort, and a quiet thread in the fabric of Roman life. In the next part, we will explore specific recipes, festival treats, and street innovations, revealing how Romans transformed simple ingredients into memorable, enduring foods. Recipes, festival treats, and street innovations. Roman snacks and sweets were simple, yet creative. The ingredients were limited, but cooks found ways to make small pleasures memorable. Globuli, small honeyed cakes, were perhaps the most common sweet. Made from wheat or barley flour, mixed with honey, and sometimes stuffed with dried fruits or nuts, they were easy to carry and eat. Children loved them, and adults sometimes used them as quick energy on long workdays. Fried pastries were another popular treat. Dough was mixed with oil, honey, and occasionally a pinch of spice. Frying created a warm, dense snack that could be sold on streets or eaten at home. Though not elaborate, these treats were satisfying and practical. Fruit and nut combinations were also common. Dried figs, dates, and raisins were rolled with chopped nuts, creating small, chewy snacks that lasted long hours without spoiling. These were especially popular during festivals, when small portions were shared or offered as offerings to gods. Cheese and bread snacks provided protein and carbohydrates. Soft cheese could be spread on bread, sometimes drizzled with honey or sprinkled with herbs. Hard cheeses were sliced into small pieces for quick consumption. These snacks were practical, calorie-dense, and accessible to both children and adults. Festival treats were slightly more elaborate. Honey cakes, sweetened pastries, and small fruit pies were offered to gods or shared among celebrants. Though still simple compared to modern desserts, they carried symbolic importance, reinforcing cultural norms and community bonds. Street vendors constantly innovated. They combined leftover bread, nuts, honey, and dried fruits to create new snacks. Steamed or lightly baked pastries offered variety. The goal was simple: attract buyers, satisfy hunger, and create small pleasures that encouraged repeat customers. These snacks were more than food, they shaped daily life, social behavior, and even the economy. Children learned to anticipate small rewards. Adults relied on quick calories to survive long hours of labor. Vendors profited from predictable tastes and patterns, contributing to the rhythm of city life. Despite their simplicity, snacks and sweets provided comfort, routine, and occasional indulgence. They balanced the harshness of everyday survival, offering warmth and satisfaction in small doses. They were a quiet thread woven through childhood, work, festivals, and family life. By nightfall, leftovers were consumed or stored, children rested, and adults reflected on the day's work. The city slept, ready to repeat the cycle of bread, wine, meat, thermopolia, and snacks. In this way, even the smallest foods influenced Roman culture, health, and social behavior. Snacks and sweets were not just indulgences, they were essential parts of life, subtly shaping generations and sustaining the empire in ways historians rarely emphasize. Drinks beyond wine, water, posca, and fermented delights. Everyday beverages of ancient Rome. While wine dominated Roman tables, it was far from the only drink. Water, diluted vinegar, fermented beverages, and herbal infusions all played essential roles in daily life. For most Romans, water was the primary source of hydration. Aqueducts brought fresh water to fountains, baths, and some homes, but access varied by wealth and location. Public fountains were common gathering spots. Children, laborers, and citizens of all classes quenched their thirst there, sometimes sharing small conversations or observing city life as they drank. Water was often combined with other ingredients to improve flavor or reduce risk. Rivers and wells were not always clean. To prevent illness, Romans mixed water with vinegar, creating posca, a tangy, slightly sour drink. Posca was especially popular among soldiers and laborers. It was cheap, safe, and provided a refreshing alternative to plain water. Fermented beverages beyond wine were also common. Beer-like drinks made from barley or spelt were consumed occasionally, particularly in provinces where grape cultivation was limited. These drinks were low in alcohol, calorie-rich, and provided sustenance along with hydration. Herbal infusions played a subtler role. Leaves, flowers, and roots were boiled to make mild teas. These could calm digestion, aid sleep, or provide minor relief from fatigue. Herbs like mint, sage, and fennel were common, their flavors familiar and comforting in daily routines. The preparation of beverages was practical. Posca was mixed in large jars for families or small groups, sometimes with herbs added for flavor. Water was drawn from fountains and stored in clay jars. Fermented drinks required controlled soaking and boiling of grains, a labor-intensive process that produced energy-dense beverages for those who needed it. Children often consumed diluted versions of adult drinks. Weak posca or watered wine introduced them to flavors, warmth, and mild fermentation early in life. These drinks shaped taste preferences, digestive habits, and social rituals from a young age. Drinks also influenced social behavior. Taverns and thermopolia sold beverages alongside food, encouraging quick consumption and interaction. Soldiers shared posca on marches, laborers drank near construction sites, and families gathered to sip water or herbal infusions at home. Beverages structured time, social interaction, and daily rhythm. Even small variations carried meaning. Sweetened herbal infusions could comfort the sick. Strong posca could invigorate tired laborers. Water mixed with vinegar was practical, safe, and a quiet symbol of survival in a city of uncertainty. By evening, the city's drinking habits shaped routine. Cups, jars, and bowls were washed, herbs collected for tomorrow, and streets reflected faint scents of fermented grains, vinegar, and herbs. Romans rested, hydrated, and prepared to repeat the cycle of meals and drinks the next day. In the next part of this chapter, we will explore how different classes consumed beverages, the subtle risks and benefits of fermented drinks, and how hydration affected daily survival and health. Social class, risks, and daily survival. Beverages in Rome were more than thirst quenchers, they shaped daily life, health, and social behavior. Class differences affected what people drank. The wealthy often consumed pure wine, diluted with water, and flavored with honey or spices. Their homes had jars of filtered water, herbs for infusions, and access to imported drinks. They drank for pleasure, status, and ritual. The poor relied on posca, watered wine, and herbal infusions. Fermented drinks like barley beer were occasional treats or survival staples in provinces. For laborers, soldiers, and children, these drinks provided hydration, calories, and a mild sense of warmth or sedation. Taste was secondary to practicality. Risks and benefits were part of daily consumption. Water from fountains or wells was sometimes contaminated, causing stomach aches or mild illness. Posca's vinegar reduced the risk of harmful bacteria, making it safer for soldiers and workers. Fermented beverages provided calories and hydration but occasionally caused mild intoxication if consumed in excess. Herbal teas were calming, helped digestion, and could mask minor discomforts from fatigue or irregular meals. Hydration shaped daily survival. Children learned early to drink what was available, adjusting to flavors and slight fermentation. Laborers paced their water and posca intake through long hours, balancing energy, warmth, and mild sedation. Soldiers marching across provinces relied on portable fermented drinks or diluted wine for sustenance. Social habits reflected beverage use. Taverns, thermopolia, and public fountains became spaces of interaction. Drinks created small moments of rest, conversation, and routine amid the bustle of the city. Sharing posca among soldiers, sipping herbal teas at home, or tasting honeyed wine at a festival reinforced social cohesion and everyday life rhythm. Long-term effects were subtle but meaningful. Children exposed to diluted wine or posca developed tolerance to mild alcohol and flavors. Adults relied on beverages for energy and calm. Even minor digestive discomfort was normalized, absorbed into daily habits, and rarely questioned. By nightfall, jars were emptied, herbs collected, and streets cooled. The smells of vinegar, fermented grains, and herbal infusions lingered in the air. Romans rested, bodies hydrated, and minds soothed, prepared to repeat the cycle of food, drink, and work the next day. Drinks beyond wine were quiet but essential companions to daily survival. They shaped nutrition, behavior, and culture, helping Rome endure, maintain labor, and sustain generations with subtle, pervasive influence. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the daily routine of Roman eating. How Romans structured their meals. In ancient Rome, daily life was built around a rhythm of meals. Unlike modern societies, food was functional, practical, and closely tied to work, family, and survival. Breakfast, or ientaculum, was simple. Most Romans ate bread, sometimes dipped in water, wine, or olive oil. A few olives, a piece of cheese, or honey might accompany it. For the poor, this meal was minimal but enough to start the day. Children often shared in their parents' food, learning early that meals were practical tools rather than indulgent experiences. Laborers and slaves sometimes grabbed breakfast on the street or near thermopolia. Porridge made from wheat or barley, often reheated from previous days, was common. Quick, filling, and portable, it allowed people to begin work without delay. Lunch, or prandium, was usually a small meal taken midday. Leftovers from the previous day's dinner, small pieces of bread, fruits, or nuts often made up the meal. For workers in construction, markets, or workshops, lunch was quick. Meals were consumed standing, walking, or during brief pauses from labor. Efficiency was critical. The city did not wait for anyone to finish eating. The wealthy enjoyed more elaborate lunches, often including meat, cheese, bread, and wine. But even these meals were practical. Portion sizes were moderate, and meals were often short. Food was a way to maintain energy and social status, not a prolonged leisure activity. Dinner, or cena, was the main meal of the day. Families gathered when possible. Wealthy citizens feasted with multiple courses: meat, fish, vegetables, bread, and wine. Poor citizens, however, often had simpler dinners: pulse, bread, small meat portions, legumes, or leftovers. This meal provided most of the day's nutrition, calories, and comfort. Children learned routines through these meals. They adapted to minimal breakfast, small lunch, and a larger evening meal. Laborers and slaves relied on this pattern to sustain energy for work that could stretch from dawn to dusk. Hunger, fatigue, and minimal nutrition were normalized, and habits formed early shaped adult endurance. Meals also reinforced social norms. Eating together maintained family bonds, highlighted differences between rich and poor, and structured city life. Taverns and thermopolia added flexibility for those without homes or kitchens, providing food that fit the same rhythm: morning porridge, midday snacks, evening sustenance. Evenings often included small snacks or sweets for children and occasional treats for adults. Honey, nuts, and dried fruits supplemented the main meal, providing calories, taste, and a tiny indulgence amid practical survival. By nightfall, homes quieted. Children rested, adults reflected on the day, and streets emptied. Rome's cycle of food, drink, and work had been repeated once more, sustaining the population with predictable rhythm, even if nutrition was minimal. Regional variations, seasonal changes, and environmental influence. Daily meals in Rome were shaped not only by social class but also by geography, climate, and the seasons. In coastal regions, fish appeared more often. Small salted fish, dried, smoked, or boiled, provided protein to those living near rivers or the sea. Inland, meat was rarer, often reserved for festivals or market days. Legumes, grains, and vegetables formed the foundation of meals in these areas. Seasonal changes dictated food availability. Spring and summer brought fresh vegetables, herbs, and fruits. Olive oil production peaked in late autumn, allowing preservation and cooking during colder months. Winter diets relied heavily on stored grains, dried legumes, salted meat, and fermented foods. Romans adapted their meals to the rhythm of nature, developing habits that ensured survival throughout the year. Trade and imports also influenced daily eating. Wealthy households enjoyed imported spices, fruits, and luxury items. The poor accessed these rarely, often through thermopolia or festival offerings. Even small flavorings, like a pinch of cumin or honey drizzle, connected everyday meals to broader trade networks, linking local consumption to the empire's economy. Children learned to recognize seasonal flavors. Fresh figs in summer, preserved dates in winter, and small treats during festivals became markers of time, subtly teaching them the rhythm of the year. Adults adapted to seasonal scarcity, using preservation techniques like drying, salting, or fermenting. To stretch resources, daily routines also shifted with climate. Hot summers encouraged lighter meals, bread, fruit, and small portions of cheese or fish. Cooler months favored heavier, warm foods like porridge, stews, and pulses, often accompanied by diluted wine or posca to provide warmth and hydration. Work schedules influenced meals as well. Farmers, builders, and laborers adjusted meal timing to maximize energy and endurance. Breakfast was quick and functional. Lunch was small but sustaining. Dinner offered the largest meal, restoring energy and allowing minimal indulgence before nightfall. Even festivals adapted meals to seasonal conditions. Summer festivals highlighted fruits, pastries, and light refreshments. Winter celebrations included hearty stews, preserved meats, and honeyed treats, ensuring energy and warmth in harsher conditions. By evening, families across regions followed similar patterns. Small snack or leftover with dinner, children nursed last morsels of porridge or honeyed bread, adults consumed the final portion of wine, posca, or herbal infusion. The cycle of daily meals continued, governed by geography, climate, and seasonal rhythms. In the next part, we will explore meal preparation, kitchen practices, and the subtle social lessons taught through food, revealing how the act of eating shaped Roman behavior, habits, and survival. Meal preparation, kitchens, and social lessons. Meal preparation in Rome was often as functional as the food itself. Kitchens were small, simple, and focused on efficiency. Wealthy households had larger kitchens with staff, while poorer families relied on open hearths or thermopolia. Breakfast was rarely cooked at home for the poor. Bread, fruit, cheese, and honey could be prepared quickly or bought ready-made. Porridge, when available, was boiled early in the morning and served warm to start the day. Lunch required minimal preparation. Leftovers, small portions of bread, and nuts were collected, occasionally heated, and consumed quickly. Workers, travelers, and children adapted to eating while standing or walking, reinforcing habits of efficiency and endurance. Dinner, the largest meal, involved more effort. Stews, pulses, and meats were cooked slowly to extract maximum flavor and nutrients. Herbs and spices added taste, while leftover bread thickened soups or stews. For wealthier families, multiple courses were prepared, but the underlying goal remained sustenance. Through these routines, Romans learned subtle social lessons. Children observed food scarcity, efficient use of leftovers, and the value of shared meals. Adults reinforced discipline, patience, and endurance. The poor adapted to irregular meals, developing resilience and tolerance. Meal timing structured the day. Breakfast marked the start, lunch punctuated midday labor, and dinner provided restoration. This rhythm became ingrained, shaping bodies and habits. Hunger was controlled, fatigue managed, and survival ensured. Even small snacks or sweets provided lessons. Children learned reward, moderation, and social norms. Adults practiced resourcefulness and planning. Street food, thermopolia, and communal meals reinforced social cohesion and daily order. Health and endurance were influenced subtly. Proper hydration, energy from simple foods, and occasional indulgence sustained populations through long workdays. Nutritional gaps were present, but routine, adaptability, and incremental calorie intake allowed survival and productivity. By evening, the city settled. Homes quieted, children slept, and streets emptied. Jars were cleaned, pots washed, and food prepared for the next day. Rome's daily life revolved around the functional rhythm of breakfast, lunch, dinner, and occasional snacks, structuring society, sustaining labor, and quietly shaping generations. Through geography, climate, seasonality, and social class, Romans developed a daily pattern of eating that balanced survival, habit, and culture. Even in a city of immense complexity, the simple act of eating maintained rhythm, order, and continuity. How ancient Romans used leftovers, preserved food, and waste not. Survival, resourcefulness, and daily life. In ancient Rome, nothing was wasted. Food was precious, and survival depended on making the most of every grain, vegetable, or scrap of meat. Leftovers were not simply stored, they were transformed, preserved, or repurposed in ways that sustained families, laborers, and communities. Leftovers from dinner often became lunch or a snack the next day. Porridge, stews, and small meat portions were reheated or combined with fresh ingredients. Bread was softened in water, wine, or olive oil to make it edible again. These practices ensured minimal waste while providing sustenance for the following meals. Preservation techniques were essential. Salting meat, smoking fish, and drying fruits allowed food to last longer. Honey and vinegar acted as natural preservatives, keeping items edible for days or weeks. Pickling vegetables and fermenting grains extended storage, making food available even during scarcity or travel. Street vendors and thermopolia played a key role in this cycle. Unsold food was often reused in stews, mixed with grains, or added to sausages. Spices and sauces disguised imperfections, turning yesterday's leftovers into today's meals. Efficiency was necessary for survival, and Romans accepted the practice without hesitation. Reuse extended beyond ingredients. Bones were boiled to extract flavor or used in broths. Olive pits, shells, and vegetable scraps found secondary purposes, sometimes as fuel or compost. Nothing edible was thrown away lightly. This mindset reflected practical survival, economy, and adaptation to urban life. Children learned early to value food, avoid waste, and participate in preservation. Adults instructed them in techniques, shared leftover recipes, and emphasized resourcefulness. These habits became ingrained, ensuring generations grew accustomed to careful, sustainable practices. Cultural rituals and festivals also reflected the value of leftovers. Special dishes were prepared for offerings to gods using preserved items. Family meals sometimes incorporated last season's fruits or stored meats, blending practicality with ritual significance. Preservation was intertwined with both survival and culture. Even small households adapted techniques for minimal waste. Clay jars, amphorae, and simple storage methods allowed families to store grains, legumes, and liquids. Olive oil and honey extended shelf life. Cold storage was improvised in cellars or shaded areas, slowing spoilage. The impact on daily life was subtle but profound. Romans consumed food more efficiently, learned patience and planning, and developed resilience. Meals were structured around availability, seasonality, and preservation, creating routines that sustained both health and labor over long hours and challenging conditions. By evening, leftover stews, softened bread, and preserved items were carefully stored or consumed. Families rested, children slept, and the city slowly quieted. Tomorrow would repeat the cycle: bread, porridge, meat, thermopolia meals, snacks, drinks, and careful use of leftovers, all sustaining the rhythms of Roman life. Through resourcefulness, preservation, and efficient use of leftovers, Romans survived, thrived, and built one of the greatest civilizations in history. Every meal, every preserved item, and every reused scrap contributed to the continuity of life, showing that even in the simplest routines, ingenuity and survival were always at play.